Hello everyone. Today we'll be reading from the Morbid Tale series, The Amorphous Horror by Zachary Miller. In case you haven't already, I have read the first book, which was The Shopkeep, and there will be a link to the playlist for this in the description where you can go find that. So this is the second book in the series, The Amorphous Horror. The Amorphous Horror. 4 p.m., Thursday, 3rd of November, 2017. Mom and Dad had remained wary of Grandpa most of their lives, or at least that's what I saw. They would sit through the mandatory bi-monthly family dinners with pursed lips and forced smiles as he would drone on about his worsening arthritis or how the basement was getting leaky. He had a neurotic character about him, always on edge, always snap-judgmental. I really liked him, but no one else in our family, immediate or extended, seemed to share the sentiment. He died a few nights ago. He died, and it was all my fault. He was a good man, your grandpa. I know it must be tough, with you being there. My father said to me, derailing my train of thought. Laura. He said my name when I did not respond to his earlier statement. What? I said, looking at the casket descending in the muddy hole in the ground. The technician handling the job pressed the button with an almost bored demeanor. There wasn't any sadness to it for him. Hell, he must have put at least 20-30 people in the ground every day. I wonder, when did it stop being melancholic for him and start being just another routine in his job? Come on, or you'll catch a cold, Dad said. He was right. It had started raining. The fresh dirt around the grave started becoming wet and reminded me of the spray of muck that had scattered all over the stairs that night in Grandpa's home. It had an unearthly smell to it. And where the muddy tracks ended lay my grandpa, his head bashed in, his eyes set in horror, and a streak of blood gurgling from his open mouth. The funeral attendees, in their drab black dresses and their fake morose faces, started dispersing under the shades of their umbrellas. After pestering me for 2-3 times more, Mom and Dad went back to their cars. Only I remained standing at Grandpa's grave and watched as the undertaker shoveled wet mud into the hole in the ground. Dust thou art, to dust returnest. Wadsworth's verse came to my mind, like a stray autumn leaf, making its way with the winding path of the fall wind. I had read many books with Grandpa. Some of them were fiction, and a lot of them were poetry. He loved poems. Prior to his death, he'd finished reading the Psalm of Life, and he had given me quite a lengthy analysis of each verse. He had not taken into consideration the fact that I was 14 and that many of these things might go over my head. After filling the grave, the undertaker tipped his hat to me and went away whistling, a sheltered cigarette in one hand and his spade in the other. I threw the posse of lilies onto the grave. I touched the Star of David tombstone and ran back to the car park where my father was waiting impatiently for me to come back. 9 p.m., Wednesday, 31st of October, 2017. Come to me tonight, Lori. I may have one last tale to tell you. Grandpa's voice wheezed from my iPhone. He coughed, splattered some phlegm on his handkerchief. Of course, I was only hearing it. And took a deep drag from his cigarette. The docs had told him repeatedly that if he wanted to live long, or live till the end of the year at least, then he should consider giving up the cancer sticks. My father died at 106, and he was a regular chimney. Smoked 3 packs a day. Resilience runs in our genes. It's a Jewish thing, he would say to them in return, shutting them up for good. I loved the smell of those hand-rolled cigarettes Grandpa used to make. I would take deep breaths every time I entered his house. That musky, pungent odor with hints of chocolate in it. I can't see why anyone would hate that scent. For me, it had become a characteristic of Grandpa Collenbuck. Just like his walking cane, his thin white stubble, his jar of licorice on the dressing table of his room, and the faint thud, thud coming from under the staircase. That, more than anything else, was what had allured me ever since I started visiting him. I wouldn't have, had it not been for the most cliched history assignment in the history of American high schools. Get a moonshine history lesson from your neighborhood old people. Ask them about the Vietnam War, the Second World War, or what were they eating when Kennedy got shot. Anything. It just so happened my grandpa lived only a block away. I hadn't spent a lot of time with him lately, and partly that was due to Mom and Dad. They didn't want me to cozy up with him. We had 2 extra bedrooms in our house, and we could have afforded to have him move in with us, or even to one of those old homes. But Grandpa denied us with dignity. "I could wipe my own crap or make my own bed, no thank you," I'd overheard him say to Dad once, during one of their many arguments. So I started visiting him. I noticed that stale smell of dirt when I first came to his house earlier in the fall. Before that, I had never had the chance to visit him. It was always him who came to our house on those mandatory bi-monthly dinners. That strange smell, the one you can easily associate with long-abandoned sewers or basement dungeons, it reeked from under the staircase. The door leading to the basement was under the stairs, and it was always locked, and throughout our sessions, until the very last one, it had remained locked, bolted, and the key was tucked inside Grandpa's tobacco pouch. Had it not been for those times when he had taken tufts of old Captain Black from that pouch, I'd never have known that the key was there in the first place, and he wouldn't have died like he did. "What's under there, Gramps?" I had asked him on numerous occasions, and he'd always dismissed me by saying that he had freshly raked and applied a drying oil to the dirt in the cellar. Nothing else. But on that night, the reeking had been unbearable, and so was the thudding, like something was prodding against the door. I went to touch the door, to peek from one of the many drafty slits on it. But before I could, Grandpa came from the top of the stairs, holding his cane, cigarette in his mouth. "Come upstairs, lass. I fixed us some cocoa," he said and smiled wanly. I crept up, following him to his bedroom. It was the only room we ever sat in. Him on his bed, and me beside it on the blue armchair. Between us would be his bedside table and its many Jewish knickknacks, the tobacco pouch, and the sheets of rolling papers. It would be a religious regimen for him every time he commenced his storytelling to take some black wisps of Virginia tobacco out of that pouch, put it in the middle of the rolling paper, roll it, and then pass his scrappy tongue over it to seal everything in place. He then lighted it with a match and arched back in his bed with a look of a relaxation only a smoker, and an age-old smoker at that, can understand. I sipped some cocoa. He had made it impeccable, just like always, and sat back in my designated place, watching the strands of thick, aromatic smoke dance around in the dimly lit room, the cellar and its creaking and its stench all forgotten. "Where were we last time?" he asked me. He relied on me daily to give him a brief recap of the story he had told the day before, and tell him where we had left off. It had been 3 months since I had first started coming to him. The first few tales had been really quaint. His life in rural Germany, his cow farm, his first wife. But then had come the part with the Nazis. He told me of how he was forced to make a run for it, but was intercepted by the SS soldiers just before he could cross the border to England. "They had me by the scruff of the neck, and they dragged me like that to the internment camp in Pateen. When they opened the doors of the car, they had kidnapped me, and all I could smell was burnt meat. They told me not to worry about it. and that I was just a sausage factory. He said last week when the real story of his life began. The story of how he got prisoned in those horrendous internment camps. The stories became worse and worse. I started resenting coming to him, but I couldn't just stop, could I? My history assignment had gotten an A+, and to stop coming after the assignment would seem downright selfish and rude. So even though the stories took a turn for the worse, I kept showing up, all alone, to the dimly lit house of my grandfather, and he smiled in that painful manner every time he'd see me. I did it for the old man, more than for myself. He had no one else. "You're at the part where they called your name out," I told him. He had told me about the first month at the camp, how they had made him wear that filthy striped dress and stuffed him in that claustrophobic bunker with 100 others just like him. Ah, yes. Well, he strained in recollection. The dimension had taken its toll on him. Sometimes he would even forget who I was, and sometimes mistake me for a woman named Bethany. Ah, yes. They called out. Not me by name, no. Asking if anyone knew woodwork. It was hot, humid, and the smell of human defecation was rife in that place. I didn't know any woodwork, or any other skill for that matter, except for milking cows and farm tending. I had to get out. I couldn't take the incessant crying, the wailing, and the looks of pallor and death on the faces of my fellow inmates. Some of them had been there for a long time, and they'd grown so frail that they looked like scarecrows. I needed to get out of there, even if it was for a short while. So, without knowing anything about woodwork, I put my hand up and said, "I've been a woodworker all my life." They grabbed me by the neck and dragged me to the workhouse. I was relieved to get away from the smell of burning meat and the sadness of the prisoners in the suffocated bunker. I felt selfish. Grandpa said and took a swig of his cocoa mug. A little froth settled on his mustache. I giggled. "What?" he asked me, a little shocked that perhaps I found his tale amusing. "You've got cocoa froth under your nose," I said. "Seems like I've had a senior moment. I've been having a little too much of them lately," he said as he wiped at his mouth with his handkerchief. Of course, he had to have senior moments. There was an age difference of 77 years between the two of us. But even then, for a 91-year-old, he looked good. There was only one other person beside me in the workhouse. I recognized him right away. Rabbi Dusseldorf. He used to frequent my farm every weekend to get some fresh milk. I made myself acquainted with him, and he eventually recognized me. He was as old then as I am now. Grandpa took a deep drag from his cigarette. Ash fell everywhere. I did not know of woodwork, and neither did he. We looked at the parts lying around and made sense of where to nail what. The Nazis weren't particularly concerned about the quality of the chairs and tables that we made. They were getting free work. Of course, for the both of us, it meant temporary safety from the kilns, the ovens. The rabbi came to me one day early morning with a ghastly look on his face, as if he was going to drop dead any moment. Fetch me as much mud as you can from the yard. Will you not, Jeremiah?" he asked of me. "An impossible task. There were guards everywhere." We were interrupted by a sudden, scary sound of gurgling, like something was clogging a drain downstairs. A gurgle, a distant rumble, and a loud roar of anger came from below. "Simmer down!" Grandpa lost his calmness for one moment, took his walking cane in his hand and clanked it on the floor of his bedroom really loudly. The growling grew, like a response to Grandpa's reprimand, and then it simmered down. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my heart palpitating and my mouth dry. The dimness of the room seemed less homely and more horrific. My grandpa, the man whom I had grown to love in the past few months, seemed like a dreary cleric with mad eyes, and the growling and grumbling seemed to belong to a ferocious beast, a boogeyman, a monster under the stairs. So, there I was, with the rabbi's impossible task burdening heavily on my shoulders. out in the yard with 100 guards looking at me suspiciously, Grandpa said sprightly, completely overlooking the commotion that had just occurred. The floor was cemented, and wherever it was not, it was grassy. There was no way I could get dirt from here, except there was one way. It was a dirty way, to say the least. But I had to do it. Back where we came from, if Rabbi asked you of a favor, you had it upon you as a religious responsibility to fulfill it. So, I went to the latrines. They were a despicable affair. I went inside one of them. They were out in the open and made of soft mud. Seeing that no one was around me, I squatted over the hole in the ground, took my pants down, I unstrapped my boots and tied my cuffs and my trousers tight. I started pouring a handful of dirt, crap, and more muck down my pants. I did that until there was no more space left inside. I walked back to the workhouse looking like I had gained 100 pounds. And that was the most difficult walk of my life. That half mile. I smelled worse than the burning meat stench that prevailed everywhere. The rabbi gleamed with happiness when I took my pants off and threw mud everywhere, crying and screaming in gibberish Hebrew. He huddled the mud everywhere with his hands, like you do at a beach to make a sandcastle. And he started chanting some weird incantation or blessing along the lines of, Alikum, Alikum, Kofem Malikum, Golam Salikum, Golam Malikum. And with my breath held like a knot in my throat, I watched as the mud started shifting and tossing and turning, as if it were alive. Grandpa said, and his eyes became wide as though recalling the event had put new life in him. I grew fearful of him in that moment, and to put more conviction to my fitfulness, the floorboards below my seat started to creak, and the hellish humdrum from below, might as well have been the recesses of hell itself, resumed like voodoo incantations. Still! Ich gesagt, still! He screamed and jumped out of his bed with a fervor that I had never associated with him. He slammed his feet on the floor and rammed his cane on the floorboards. I pulled my feet up the blue chair, curled my knees to my shin, and watched all of this with dread. The bulbs in the room, dim as they already were, flickered out. We were in utter darkness. I yelped a small cry. And then everything went back to normal, or what passed for normal in Grandpa's demented world. I could see for a second why everyone in the family avoided him, why no one would visit him. Did they know something all along that I didn't? Grandpa, what's happening? Rats and rodents and rats, nothing to worry about, he said and sat back down, resuming his weakened demeanor. So, as I was saying, the mud came to life, and just as it did, the rabbi fell to the floor, dead. The guard was coming inside the workhouse to check up on us, and I knew that I had to run. But what are the things standing in front of me? I had heard of golems and tales my mother used to tell me, of how they were made of mud, and how their eyes peered in the dark like hot embers. But this was the first time I was seeing one. It was small, up to my calves, and had a peevish look on his otherwise expressionless face. Was it a golem? A real one? I asked. He looked at me with frustration, as if he was angry at my incredulity. Then it went away, the anger, and he simply nodded. My companion was a gift to me by my rabbi, and right in front of me he seemed to grow, sucking ground, dirt, and mud from everywhere around it. Within minutes, he went from being the height of my knee to the floor of being half my size. The guard was coming close, and by the sound of his urgency, it looked like he had overheard the commotion. Before I had a moment to register any of the details, the guard was upon me. He rifle-butted the back of my head and was about to alert the others. Below, the wondrously behold, that sculpture of mud and dirt was upon the guard, attacking him like one of your, Pokemons. He shouted and started cackling. I was finding it hard to believe one word of his story. Golems? Magical rabbis? Grandpa seemed to have gone off his rocker. It was getting late. I had to go back home, otherwise Mom would give me hell for staying up past bedtime. Grandpa, I need to go, I said hastily and stood up from my seat, my skirt damp from sweat. But you must stay. I'll keep short, he said in an old man's pleading voice. I couldn't bear to leave him alone. Apart from the maid that showed up every morning to clean the house and cook his food, I was the only other person who ever showed up to his house. So, grudgingly, I sat back down. The guard. I was telling you of the golem and how I'd taken down the guard. The opportunity was right for me. I had to make a run for it. Any sane person would do the same. And the only person obstructing my passage lay unconscious and possibly dead at my feet. The golem looked at me happily, its ember eyes glowing with menace. I took up the guard's trench coat and wore it as my own. It would have been wiser if I had taken off all his uniform and disguised myself as an SF soldier. I had so much scorn and hatred for them in my heart back then that I made do with the scarcest disguise I could take from him, he said, sitting back down in the bed and rolling another one of his cigarettes. So I ran a straight line for the fences to the right of the workhouse, and I knew that the guards had seen me making a run for it, but my friend, the golem, had taken on a bigger shape. He had, in the time it took me to wear the coat and make a run for the fence, grown to my height. I ran and ran, and when I came to the fence, I knew that I had to jump over. Never mind the barbed wires, the rumors of electricity ran through the metal border. I climbed it, my hands bleeding, the jagged, sword-like edges piercing into my skin, and the golem followed. We ran, and bullets flew around us, past us, and through us. There's still one of them stuck in my calf. I never got it operated, never got it out. On rainy days it turns cold and alien-like against the meat around it. Grandpa said in a long breath, and then drooped his head downwards, asleep. I wanted to know what happened next, but at the same time I wanted to leave him sleeping. He could continue the story the next day, and just before I was about to get up from my blue chair for a second time, he jolted awake. And I ran! When I had made my way, as far away from the camp as I could, I took the coat off. So many bullets had passed through it. It looked like Swiss cheese. Like Swiss cheese! There was a ravine south of Patine, and a deep river leading down to it. I jumped in, not knowing if I'd come out or drown my death, he said in a dreamy drawl. That is how I escaped. What about your friend? I asked. What friend? The golem! The one that helped you escape! What golem? I never said anything about golem. What are you talking about? Grandpa asked lividly. Was he doing this on purpose, or had the dementia kicked in again? I had not planned on finding out. So that's how you ran away? From Patine? The most dangerous camp after Auschwitz? Just like that? I scoffed. Of course! When the Allied forces came, they set us all free and killed the camp guards right in front of our eyes. One of the soldiers, a good American man, came to me and draped me in a blanket and told me all was over, all was fine, he said, and drew back to his sporadic sleep again. This made no sense to me. Had there been a golem who had saved him, or had he been saved by the Allied forces? Angrily, I shook him to wake him up and inquire of him as to which version was the real one. He did not budge. His snores started becoming louder and louder. That was my cue to leave. But, oh, his tobacco pouch. It was lying right there, open, and inside from it gleamed the key to the basement. He'd forgotten to seal the pouch after he'd rolled the last cigarette. The cigarette that now rested against his lips, still glowing. It would cinch his lips if he did not wake up the next minute to step it out in the ashtray. The floor grumbled again, and this time the floorboards beneath me shook like an earthquake. I was gripped by terror. but also by this newfound feeling of intrigue. Had I gotten mad after listening to the delirious tales of an old man? I don't know. I don't know what came over me when I quietly put my hand inside the pouch and took out the key. Grandpa did not budge. I tiptoed my way out of the room and into the corridor. Grandpa had told me that the reason he kept all the lights dim in the house was because he had degenerating corneas. The more light fell on them, the worse they gave way. In the darkness, I crept down the stairs, my heart yammering like a jackhammer in my throat, and beads of perspiration and fear wetting my entire body. The key felt clammy and cold in my hand, and at once I had the urge to throw it away. But I couldn't just do that, could I? I was overcome with curiosity to see for myself what was in the basement that made the noise. It scared me, don't get me wrong, but at the same time I had this frustration built up inside me. I've been coming here every day, religiously, to listen to his stories. Every single day. And how does he decide to end it? With a freaking double-sided ending. Of course, the one with the Allied forces saving him made more sense. It was plausible. But deep within me, deep in that child's heart of mine, the heart that starts to wither and die the moment you enter adolescence, and I definitely entered into mine, that yearned to believe that there was some truth to the golem story. And it was that dying, telltale heart of mine that coaxed me into doing what I was about to do. It sensed me approaching, that entity in the basement, for as I descended, the whole house started shaking. The roaring became threatening, and the lights flickering. Each step I took down the stairs became a mountainous effort in the wake of all the shaking and jolting. I was going to fall any second, and had the rumbling not simmered down in that second, I surely would have tripped my way down the steep steps and would have broken my nose or legs. But for a second, the flickering of the light stopped. Silence prevailed except for the snoring of my grandpa, and the floor beneath me became steady. In that brief window, I ran down the steps, sweaty palms holding the key, and came to a stop right in front of the door that led down to the cellar. If there was anything down there, and if the pungent odor that reeked everywhere was just the oily dirt floor, and if the flickering of the lights was just due to the faulty wiring of the house, and if all the quivering and quaking was just due to some earthquake, it would mean that Grandpa's story had no golem in it. That he had been saved, not by a Jewish creature of myth, but by the Allied forces, like how it happened in the books. But if, by any chance, there was something inside the basement, something that my telltale heart told me was there, something mythical, something monstrous that was just causing the growling, the tremor, the flickering, then the golem would be real, and it'd be waiting for me down in the basement. Of course, by then it will be too late. But hey, at least I will have known the truth. I turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open into the darkness. There was nothing to be seen, only the stairs disappearing into void of the basement. I turned to peek into the basement and tried to turn the light on, but a pair of gleaming ember eyes caught me in their gaze. Whatever it was seemed to be breathing a hot stench out from its mouth towards me. Before I could so much as move a muscle, the amorphous mass of mud and mold came crashing towards me from the stairs, laughing with its sneering mouth, shaking every bit of the house as it came trampling up the stairs. I yelled and screamed towards the top of the stairs. Please, Grandpa, be awake. Do something. I've made a mistake. I tripped and skittered across the floor towards the flight of steps. Only one quick look did I manage to steal behind me, and that was enough to last me a lifetime of nightmares and therapy sessions. A dark, black, Humongous mass of mud rose from the doorway, rising, and covering the entire space towards the top of the flight of stairs. How large was it? I can't quite tell you. Maybe 100 feet high. It stood bowing against the ceiling of the second floor, in a congested state, stuck halfway in the stairs and halfway stuck in both the first and second floor corridors. "Jeremy!" He yelled at me with an ominous timbre, and extended his crane-like hand towards me. Here came my death. Getting crushed by a golem at my grandpa's house was certainly not how I had imagined I would die. But does it matter? Its unfaltering hand came and grasped me, and already I could feel my bones begin to crunch in his unforgiving grip. "Jeremy! I'm here, you golem bastard! Optional! Came the sound from the top of the stairs. It was Grandpa, and he sounded livid. "Jeremy!" The golem, Goliath in his stature, screamed. I could only make out its arms and its legs. Its head was up in the flight of stairs, staring, I presumed, at Grandpa. Its grasp around me tightened, and I let out yet another scream. I was sure I was going to die, right there in the arms of the monster I had unleashed. Oh, how I had designed my own catastrophe. Darkness swooned around me, and breathlessness began to engulf me in its black stupor. And yet, like standing at the end of a long tunnel, I heard Grandpa's voice telling me that it'll be okay, calling the golem to optional. Later, I come to know that it meant stop in Yiddish. I heard the sound of my grandpa's cane as it struck the golem in the head. Its grip on me loosened, and for a moment I thought everything was going to be all right. Grandpa's golem was his pet, his subservient, after all. But he was going to be put back in the cellar. Scold me for stealing his key, then I'll finish my cocoa and he'll tell me the real ending of the story. And then I'll go home. I'll put all this business behind us. But that's not what happened. Instead, the golem released me and used his hand to pull the cane away from Grandpa. And as it pulled, Grandpa came falling down the spiraling stairs. He must have died the moment his frail head hit the first step. He rolled, bloodied and muddied, down the stairs and fell at my feet, his cold, lifeless eyes staring at me in a blaming manner. "Look what you've done, you stupid child," they seemed to scream. I couldn't bear to look at his split-open head, and now it oozed brain and blood upon the wooden floor. Tears welled up in me, equal parts horror, equal parts sadness. And as I cried, I saw through my bleary eyes the golem take a look at Grandpa's dead body, and then dissolve into nothingness. Its legs gave away first, sending a mudslide everywhere. His arms flopped in mid-air and broke into many pieces like stale bread. His head came apart, and only the two emperor eyes remained in that immense mound of soil, of shapeless dirt smelling like a graveyard. I did not overcome my hysteria. All I did was sit and wail in the dank and humid dark on the edge of the stairs, with Jerome Collenbach's body half submerged in the dead golems. And I wailed when eventually my father and mother came looking for me. They dialed 911 and wrapped me in a blanket and told me everything was going to be okay. When I failed to move from my spot, staring fixedly at the dim embers glowing in the dusk, they gave up and waited for the ambulance to arrive. One of the paramedics forcibly injected me with something that made me woozy and calm and sleepy. No one asked me about the mud. Not then, not later. They assumed that this basement had flooded with it, and it all came out of its own accord. Grown-ups! They'll believe anything as long as it's within their plausibility. The injection put me asleep. But it wasn't a dreamless sleep. No. I know that from now, for a long time to come, as long as I'll live, that amorphous horror will haunt me in my waking and in my sleep.